comes from working in the library for 30 years.
We are live.
Hello, and welcome to another author event at the Poison Pen Bookstore. I'm John Charles, and tonight the Poison Pen is honored to have with us Edgar-nominated best-selling author Stephanie Wrobel.
Thank you guys for having me, and thank you all for being here. Is this on? Okay.
It just doesn't sound like it.
Yeah.
Stephanie's new book is The Hitchcock Hotel. We do have a few copies left, but they're going like pancakes on a good Sunday breakfast day, so get them while they last. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us tonight and those tuning in virtually. Why don't we start by having you tell us a little bit about who Stephanie was before you became a published author?
Sure. So before I became an author, I worked in advertising. I was a copywriter because I thought nobody actually makes a living writing books. So this was the next best thing that I could think of. So I spent a lot of time writing TV spots and billboards and all that kind of stuff. And then, it was during a move to London where the advertising industry is incredibly competitive. I spent a lot of months unemployed, and then I decided to give the writing thing a go. But I was in advertising for like 7 or 8 years before switching to writing.
But you did want to write early on. I seem to remember you had some manuscript called How Mary Ann Got Lost at the Zoo.
Yes.
In your background.
It had a happy ending. I did not start writing dark stuff until I was much older. I don't know why I was inspired to write the stories when I was 5 or 6 years old, but I've just always had an impulse to tell stories.
And then you got into the master's program?
Yes, so I went to Emerson College in Boston for my master's. Like I said, I had gone through this period of unemployment, and I was like, what am I doing with my life? And I decided, I had never taken a creative writing class. It was all just purely instinct-based at that point, and I really thrive in sort of structured environments. So I said, okay, I'm going to do this program. I'm going to try to write a novel as my thesis, and then hopefully, best case scenario, I get an agent. Worst case, I get a graduate degree. And that thesis ended up being Darling Rose Gold, which is my debut novel. So everything worked out really, really well. It was a lot of hard work, but also it was like being in the right place at the right time. So
what can you tell us, or what would you like to tell us about the Hitchcock Hotel? And I know you have to be careful because there's a lot of twists in there.
Yes. So for anyone I guess I'll just give a very loose background on it. For anyone who's unfamiliar, the Hitchcock Hotel is about this man named Alfred Smettle. He is obsessed with Hitchcock, and so he decides to open this Hitchcock-themed hotel. And on the 1-year anniversary of the hotel's opening, he decides to invite 5 of his former best friends from college. He hasn't spoken to them in 16 years for a reason. And they all show up. And why would they all show up when they haven't spoken to this guy in so long? They all have their reasons for being there. He has his reason for inviting them. Hitchcockian chaos ensues.
People check in, but they don't check out.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Yeah. I think like one of the taglines I've been using is like, checking in is easy, checking out is another story. Yeah.
Why Hitchcock? What inspired you to use him as the launching point for the book?
So for anyone who's read the book, this will sound familiar. When I was in college, I took a film studies course with a professor named Dr. Scott, which is where the fictitious Dr. Scott's name came from. There's no resemblance between the two other than that they're both professors. And there I was introduced to North by Northwest, and that was the first Hitchcock film that I saw. Hitchcock made a lot of espionage thrillers. Those are not personally my favorites. They're great, but surprise, surprise, I go for the dark psychological stuff. And so when I was younger, I really only saw the most famous stuff. So Psycho, The Birds, Rear Window. But I wanted an excuse to dive deeper into, all of his films. I mean, not all of them. There's 53. But so this seemed like a pretty good excuse to watch movies during the day.
What I like about you using Hitchcock is, in a way, you remind mystery readers that he, in his way, was just as important as Agatha Christie.
Yes, so it's funny you bring her up. I mean, it's become very popular in my genre for authors to pay homage to Christie and just kind of iterate off of her work, freshen it, do whatever to do the, 21st century spin on it. And I was like, who else is a giant of the genre that I can do that to? Now, obviously, there's no shortage of people looking up to and kind of spinning off of Hitchcock's work, but I wanted to do it in a really overt way, and you can't get more overt than putting his name in the title, so.
One of the things that I also think is interesting is you kind of illustrate the difference. We tend to lump mysteries all together under crime fiction usually, but there's a difference between a mystery and a suspense or thriller. How do you define them?
So I think I have never written a mystery before. This is the first one that I think, well, hopefully it does a genre switch halfway through, which I stole from Psycho, which is a crime caper that turns into a psychological thriller. This is a psychological thriller that turns into a whodunit. To me, a mystery means there's a body or a crime has been committed. We need to figure out who did it. I would describe my first two books as psychological thrillers, where these people are doing sort of inexplicable things, but we want to figure out why they're doing them. And there's still surprises, but it's not the same as, a crime has been committed and we need to resolve. Didn't have a lot of love for surprise. He wanted suspense. So his audience was almost always, or at least often, half a step or a few steps in front of his characters. And you would think, I think there's kind of been a shift away from that in my genre where it's all about the twist and how do we surprise and catch the reader off guard. But when you go back and watch his films, you really are on the edge of your seat because you have more information and you know that bomb is about to go off. So it was a really interesting craft study to kind of revisit that.
I'm glad you mentioned twist because you wrote something that I thought was rather insightful. You said in the best books, the twist is the icing on the cake. As a reader, I don't want to race through the book for a twist. Rather, I want it to take me by a delightful surprise as the story reaches its denouement. And then you did kind of a survey of different kinds of twists.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, it's one of my little pet peeves that I think in this genre specifically, readers are very apt to sort of they want to get to the end, they want to figure out the twist. And on one hand, that means the book is well paced and that's great. But as the person who spends 10 months to 2 years writing the other 349 pages, it can be a little, but no, it's kind of in a playful way. But yeah, I do find twists really interesting. I think you're referring to, I think I did a 7 kinds of twists.
Yeah,
I wrote that a few years ago, so I couldn't pretend to even remember what I said they were. But yeah, I try to be a student of the genre and a student of different craft techniques because it is interesting to me. Why are some twists so good and then others are just kind of yeah, okay. So yeah, it is interesting to me to study from kind of a more technical perspective. So basically what I did when I wrote that article is I took a bunch of books with really stellar twists and some with not so stellar, and I kind of cataloged what do they have in common. Someone you thought was good was bad, someone you thought was dead was alive, that kind of stuff. And didn't really actually help writing of future books because you can't just be well, I think I'll just put a dead person that's actually alive in there. But it's interesting nonetheless, I think.
It is interesting, and there are some wonderful twists in the book. It's a mystery, but you do throw in those unexpected moments that the readers aren't looking for. But The Hitchcock Hotel is not just a mystery. It's also, in a way, a book about friendship.
Yeah. So it was an excuse for me to kind of revisit my college years, which I'm not a super nostalgic person, but I do find myself getting nostalgic for friendships in that time of my life. These are best friends that you lived with. We all lived in the same house, and so we saw each other not only every day, but throughout every day. And yeah, I'll sometimes find myself getting wistful. Of course, I'm still friends with these people, but we're all in different states and in some cases countries. So there's just not the same closeness that happens post-college. I think we all kind of turn towards career and maybe partnerships and then children. And so this gave me an excuse to sort of little waxing of, nostalgia on the old college days, I suppose.
Setting also plays an important role in the book.
Mm-hmm.
Was there a real life inspiration for this book, or did you dream up the Hitchcock Hotel?
So I've realized setting is really hard for me, and so to make it easier on myself, I do try to find real life places and grab some photos and then just describe little details in those photos. So for the exterior, I was picturing, surprise, surprise, the Bates family house behind the motel. I just thought that is the perfect New England bed and breakfast. And then for the interior, there's this hotel in Scotland called the Fife Arms in northern Scotland. And it has a very, dark and moody vibe. The decor is all very plush rugs and stuff like that. So, yeah, so I borrowed from there and used a lot of those details to kind of make my own setting come alive. Yeah.
Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the role of the villain in the book.
Okay.
Because there's a lot of characters in there. You write a lot of gray characters, let's put it that way. They're not all black and white.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I get dinged for that a lot because I've read a lot of reviews of like, there's no one likable in this book. And I was like, well, I needed a lot of suspects for murder. You can't have, 6 or 7 angels. So yeah, my favorite characters to write, again, if you've read any of my books, this may not be a surprise, are the stranger, the darker, the harder to identify with, the more that I enjoy writing them. Because, just writing like the straight man for me is the most boring, I suppose. You need them in every book, but, I live a pretty normal, average life. So I think for me, it's I guess when like an actor says, oh, I get to pretend to be someone else, it's kind of that feeling. So yeah, I mean, you could definitely say there's a specific villain in the book, but like you're saying, I think we could say definitely more than one character is villainous.
But what I like is you also, you want to hate some of the villains, we'll call them in the book, but you also kind of show that they have another side to them too.
Yeah, because I don't really believe that anyone is all good or all bad. I mean, there are certainly people who come close, but in real life, I think we're all shades of gray. And so I think each person has to have, nobody, even a murderer, no one's motivation is just, I'm going to commit this for no reason at all. Everybody's got to have an underlying motivation. And so I think trying to pull those things out, even if you don't have to identify with the person, you don't have to like them, but at least, there's some understanding of why they've done the things they've done throughout their lives.
Let's go back to Hitchcock a little bit because you put a lot of Easter eggs, for lack of a better word, in the book. Mm-hmm. Did you know exactly what you wanted, or did those come through a process? You slowly added them.
They came through a process. So I would say some of the stuff that I knew from the beginning were the different ways of murder and violence. So Hitchcock really loved poison, strangulation, shoving people from heights. And so I wanted to hold myself to using those things. I wasn't going to do, he thought like just shooting someone was like the easy way out. He thought it was a very American way to commit murder, not like the polite British way. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to hold myself to specifically the stuff that he was really fond of. And I tried to do that with motifs as well, with like staircases and crows, or like birds are very influential and important in Hitchcock's movies. So it was really fun because it provided an extra layer of challenge of like, well, we can't just have this, whatever, someone fall from a building out of nowhere. It's got to make sense in the plot. And so I can't remember at what points in the writing process. It's so funny when you're asked to reflect on the writing process after the fact, you're like, I don't know, it was like a fever dream of sorts, like who can recall at what point like things came together? But yeah, they did slowly.
Was Danny an homage to Mrs. Danvers?
She was indeed.
Okay.
I think a pretty blunt one by, with intention, Danny, Mrs. Danvers, like it's pretty, for those who don't know, the movie Rebecca was adapted from a book of the same title by Daphne du Maurier, which is one of my favorite books of all time. And Mrs. Danvers is one of my favorite characters in literature. She's just this like super creepy, possessive, obsessive housekeeper. And I channeled some of that into Danny, which is the housekeeper at the Hitchcock Hotel. She's kind of Alfred's right-hand man.
You can enjoy the book without knowing the movies that inspired it. It stands on its own. But if you know the movies, it adds that other layer because you do something with a glass of milk that's really quite creepy.
Yeah, yeah. I know. That's another motif, like Hitchcock and milk. Who would have thought? Like that's, until I started doing the research, I didn't know. But yeah, I think, we had to make sure, and my publishing team and I had to make sure that this book could be enjoyed by people who have never seen a Hitchcock movie in their life and don't really care to, because I don't know, it'll be interesting as, the book is now out in the world for all of 24 hours. It'll be interesting to see how many people actually are interested in Hitchcock versus just want to read a good thriller. But yeah, I think for the people who do know a lot about Hitchcock, there's probably like extra sort of rewards in there.
Not that you would, but was there any thought about how, you always hear how authors' estates are terribly territorial about
Oh,
a
yeah.
work. I mean, did you worry? Is there like a Hitchcock estate that you had to clear things through, or?
No, so when I first pitched the idea to my publisher, they had to check with the legal department. I don't know what all that entailed, but no issues came back clearly because, I mean, that was like step one before anything was even written. So hopefully there's no problem. If the book suddenly disappears,
Well,
then
no
you'll
lie.
know.
Do you have a favorite of your own of Hitchcock's films?
Can I pick two?
Yeah.
Okay. So Rope is one. It was at the time like really technically challenging because it's like a continuous shot. Like 1917, more recently, that movie, if you've seen it. It is a movie where in the first scene, two men strangle their best friend to death and then put his body in a steamer trunk and then host a dinner party in that apartment and spend the entire time trying to not get caught for killing someone. So it sounds like I've just told you the entire movie, but it's actually incredibly suspenseful, even though you know those things right off the bat. And that was such a good lesson in suspense, like we talked about, suspense versus surprise. And then the other one is Rebecca, which I've kind of already referenced. I think, to be fair, I have like the background of the book first, which like is just so well written. But then the adaptation, which I actually just watched for the first time recently, is amazing as well. It really, in my opinion, it really holds up. You know, you never know when you're watching movies from the 1940s or in some cases the mid 1920s if they are going to hold up. And sometimes, you know, some of his movies, there are like the overwrought women who are like fainting when something stressful happens, which has never happened in real life, I would assume. But others really feel like they hold up. So that was one of them for me.
It was a really good movie, with the
Yeah.
exception they had to change the ending slightly.
Oh yeah, the ending. Yeah, they should have left the. Yeah, they should have left the book.
Let's talk a little bit about your writing process, because that can differ for different authors. From what I understand, yours is quite elaborate. It involves a lot of sidelines or
Yeah, so
accompaniments.
I have actually been kind of iterating, I should say, on my process. So with the first two books, I outlined very heavily. I had to have a sentence summary for every chapter before I would start writing. And then I realized I was throwing away like half to 2/3 of every first draft. So I was like, maybe this outlining thing isn't my best process. So with this one, I tried to be a little bit less regimented. So before I started writing, I knew where the story would start. I knew it was going to be this guy waiting in the parking lot for his 5 friends to show up at the beginning of this weekend. And I also knew who was going to die and at what point in the book, but I didn't know who killed them. I didn't know a lot of, like I said earlier, Hitchcockian sort of things happen. I didn't know who was going to be doing those things. Would it be the same person as the murderer? Would it be different people? If it's different people, why are they doing this stuff? So it was, again, just like I had never really written that way before. And it was cool because it provided like little puzzles and surprises for me along the way.
Does it get easier book to book, or is each book a different challenge?
I think each book is a different challenge, but with intention, because I don't want to just write the same thing over and over. To me, this book feels very different from my first two. I think it's a lot more fun, and it's definitely the plottiest book that I've written. It's not as dark. I know I've said there's a dead body, but it's not as dark as the other ones. So yeah, although I will say I found writing this was the easiest book that I've written thus far. It was way easier than This Might Hurt, which was my second. I don't know if you guys are familiar, but there's like a sort of understood mythology in the writing community that the second book is the hardest one. So I'm hopeful that I have that behind me, because that was 7 drafts in 2 years. And this one, I think start to finish was like 10 months. So yeah.
You had mentioned that your books are scary, but they're not graphic. I think that's something you share with Hitchcock. You kind of give the illusion, or you put the idea in a reader's mind that something's happening, but you don't lay it out on the page necessarily.
Yeah, because I think that the reader's imagination is more graphic than whatever I'm going to write. Letting you fill in the blank is going to be scarier. And also, I don't revel in writing gore. It's just like not personally my cup of tea. I sometimes read horror, and when I get to like a really graphic scene, I'm like, just reading it is like uncomfortable and you kind of want to speed through. So the idea of spending like weeks, possibly months, like revising and reworking, like how did the bow and arrow go through her gut is just like, no, thank you. I'll leave that to Grady Hendrix. He's very good at those scenes.
Your prior background is in marketing and you worked in copywriting. Writers, it's not enough just to write a book anymore. You have to be your own promotional team.
Yeah.
Does having that background make it easier to promote your books?
I think so, probably. I mean, I did do a lot of social media stuff when I was in advertising. I think a lot of writers and artists are sort of resistant to the idea that they're a brand, which I understand why. Like, nobody wants to feel like a commodity, but I also understand, like, it's a reality of how, I mean, there's so many books published every month and it's so hard to get these, like, big media placements that you have to use your own platform to sort of spread the word about yourself. So I don't find it as horrible as I think a lot of people do. I will say during publication time, I feel way too online. So after, the next couple weeks, I'll be really glad to kind of go back into my hidey hole and stare at a wall and not talk to anyone for a few months.
You mentioned brand. For people who've never read your books, how would you describe your brand?
That's a good question. I should have had an answer for that, given what I just said. I don't know, because now I feel like this book, so I still think, even though it's not as psychological, I think like dark psychological dives is something I'm interested in. I'm always looking to write about society's outliers. I think these people tend to stay more within the norms of society. I say that and then think about what they do, and I'm like, not really. Yeah. But compared to, Munchausen by proxy or a cult, let's say, where it's kind of more publicly out there. I'm just really interested in what makes people tick. So I think there will always be, like, heavy psychological elements to my work.
Character-driven.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Stephanie as a reader. You write suspense novels. Is that what you read? Do you read across the genre? Who are some of the books that have made a mark on you as a reader? So
I used to read a lot. I used to read for pleasure, suspense and thrillers a lot more. Now, being asked to blurb, it's mostly thrillers and suspense. So when I get to just pick for my own leisure what I want to read, I actually try to read outside of it, because I think that helps improve me as a writer and reader more. So I like general fiction. I really like speculative fiction, which I'll call, like The Handmaid's Tale or The Power by Naomi Alderman. But yeah, I like to read widely because there's different things you can learn from different genres that they do really well, that maybe like my genre doesn't. Like my genre excels at pacing and twists and all of that stuff, but there's other stuff to be learned from other genres. So,
would you ever want to write in a different genre?
Probably. I think I'd like to expand. Like, speaking to brand, though, I think, it's kind of a tricky thing. You start to establish yourself as one thing. But yeah, that goes back to the whole wanting to continue challenging yourself. I don't just want to write kind of like two POVs, this cat and mouse game, like every single time. I want to kind of go bigger and go bolder. So we'll see.
In addition to writing, you also help other writers through your website. I've noticed you're very generous about giving advice. What are your top pieces of advice you'd give to an aspiring writer?
I always feel like this is the most basic answer, because every established writer will say this, but I think it's really important. And this was my biggest setback, I guess, when I was starting out, which is keeping yourself to a schedule and committing yourself to deliverables. Even if it's 100 or 500 words a week, a month, whatever, it doesn't have to be fast. But I think it's really daunting even if you have written a novel, it's daunting every time you start a new one, because it's 90,000 words. That's a long project. And especially when you don't have any guarantee of income, you don't have a contract, nobody's on your back. I think you have to find a way to hold yourself accountable. So one thing I've always found helpful is to track my word count as I'm writing. Even if I end up deleting them and going back, it's nice to see, because when you're just starting out, or even when you're 10,000 words in, you're like, oh my God, I still have 80,000 more to go. So it helps to see every day, like, okay, I added another 1,000, another 1,500. And then if you start tracking, you can see like, oh, in 3 months, I'll have a finished first draft, or whatever your time frame is. But I think otherwise it just feels endless. Like this, I compare it to marathons. If anyone has done long distance races, like it's exactly the same mindset where you just like have to be disciplined and diligent and really a self-starter. I mean, you really can't make it as a writer if you're not. So yeah, that's kind of the direction that I advise.
You've now written 3 books.
Mm-hmm.
What surprised you the most about the business of publishing?
Oh God, that's like a whole talk on its own. I think so. Having come from corporate America, I was accustomed to like, if you're good at your job and the longer you do your job, you slowly make more money, you get raises, you climb the ladder, assuming no sort of catastrophic whatever. That is not what a writing career is like at all. Theoretically, we're getting better as we write longer. But the successes and failures are very roller coastery. So just because your first book did really well doesn't mean the next one will. Just because you made a lot of money in this doesn't mean you will in the future. Critics could love a book, but regular readers hate it, and vice versa. So there's a lot of, I guess, unexpected turns to the career. And it's also it's a lot more vulnerable than I thought it would be. Putting your work out into the world, especially now that everyone's so online and, so in social media, it's almost impossible to escape people's reactions to your work. I don't read Amazon or Goodreads reviews because it's just punishing. Yeah, I'll forget the 5-star reviews immediately, but I can commit to memory the 1-star reviews after a single reading. But, when you're on Instagram, if you're getting tagged and stuff that's negative, you can't really avoid it unless you just don't go on social media at all. So yeah, there's been sort of a push and pull of trying to navigate that and kind of like protect myself, but like still, be out there and kind of, yeah.
How involved with you are, because book covers sell books. I mean, there's like when a reader comes into a bookstore or library, they have like 7 seconds to see covers, and that can make or break the sale.
Yeah.
How involved are you with your book covers?
So I'm very lucky with my U.S. publisher. With every book, they ask me for like inspiration of other covers that are kind of tonally what I'm picturing, and they really do take my suggestions on board. Having said that, every single one of my covers in the US has been almost exactly what the final cover is. They just have nailed it every time. In other markets, I have not felt that way. And in other markets, when they say, yeah, give us some feedback, and I say, well, I would switch this, and they say, thank you very much, we won't be doing that. But so it kind of depends on the publisher is the answer. I think that readers and people outside the industry think that writers have a lot more control over covers than they actually do. But in this case, yeah, they just keep knocking it out of the park. So that has not been a stressor, thankfully.
What's your relationship like with your editor, your U.S. editor?
Oh, it's great. She's wonderful. I always joke, but it's not a joke, that every time I turn in a first draft, her response is some variation of maybe a little more subtlety stuff. Like I always just like throw everything at the wall. With this book, in the first draft, I had all of the staff members dressed up like as Hitchcock characters. I also had they would wake guests up by throwing live crows at them, and she was like, "Who would pay to stay in such a place?" And I was like, well, The Shining, the place that The Shining was based off of, they've had a wait list for 50 years for that room. But she's correct. And so usually she's almost always right. There's very few times when I've really put my foot down and been like, no, I think it has to be this. It's very hard to have any sort of objectivity or distance from your own book. So the thing that whenever I feel any resistance to feedback, the thing that I try to remind myself is we all want the same thing, which is the best book that there can be. So yeah, we work very well together, and she knows exactly how I like to receive feedback and what will help me and what won't, because I've worked with the same editor for my whole career so far. So now we kind of have that easy rapport built in too.
Outside of writing, do you have any spare time left at all? And if you do you have hobbies?
Yes, I do. So I love to travel. Going to Australia at the end of the year for a month, which I'm super excited about. And I love food, so I'm just like eating a lot. I always say I've moved around a lot, but I've always lived in or near big cities, and that's because I need a good food offering. But yeah, a lot more free time outside of pub time. It's a very weird existence because for, a year or two, like nobody talks to you at all. No, you could be like dead for weeks. And I mean, professionally, obviously my family talks to me, but, and then you go into publication and it's like, everybody's talking to you. So it's an interesting sort of dichotomy. Yeah. Yeah.
And I imagine it's hard. Maybe it isn't for you as an author, but you're touring for this book and you're probably already thinking and plotting your next book.
Yeah, so that's another thing that people outside the industry don't really know is from the time you finish a book, it takes 9 to 12 months for it to hit shelves. So people always think I'm being like so industrious by saying I've written half of the next one, but this book has been done since the end of 2023. So, what am I just going to like sit for 9 months and just be like, well, it's almost out. It's really almost out. So yes, I've written half of the next book. Yeah.
So there is something coming and you don't want to say anything, or will you say anything about it?
I don't want to say anything. It will come in 2026 sometime. And it will be another thriller. Okay, well, I'll say a few things. It will be 2 points of view. And it's going to take place over a Christmas dinner, so only over 3 or 4 hours, which is one of the new challenges. Like I said, there's always these craft challenges you want to set for yourself. I had never done such a confined period of time, and I really wanted to try that.
I guess the best way readers could find out when the book is coming is to contact your social media, or
Yes.
And you do have a website, and
Yes, my website is stephanieWrobel.com, and on Instagram, I'm at Stephanie Wrobel. That's where I'm the most active. I've kind of given up on Twitter, as many of us have.
Well, we do want to leave a few minutes left for questions because you have quite a number of fans here. So if there's any questions for Stephanie, now's your chance to ask them. She'll call on you if you don't.
Yeah, don't make me be a teacher.
Yeah?
Yes.
All the way in the back.
7 characters, are they based off of anyone in particular, or how'd you get that idea to do that many characters?
Yeah, so did everyone hear that, or should I repeat the question? Okay, so the question was basically, I have 7 point of view characters. How did I come up with them? Who are they based on? So this was my largest cast by far. My other books were only 2 or 3 points of view. And so when I was first starting out writing this book, I was like, okay, I've got this guy, Alfred. He needs, 5 friends to come in, and how am I going to keep them all straight in my head? So I've always been fascinated by the 7 deadly sins. And I was like, I'm going to have each one of them be one of the 7 deadly sins. And so, for example, Zoe is a chef, and she represents gluttony. And then there's like a trust fund baby named Julius, and he's sloth. And so that was a way to help me differentiate them from each other in the beginning until they kind of came more alive with other characteristics. And it also helped give them vices. Like I chose their careers based on that. And yeah, that was definitely one of the things I was most nervous about with this book is character soup, that they wouldn't be at all distinguished from one another, that you wouldn't be able to keep them straight. And I know readers get really ornery when there's too many characters and you can't keep them straight. So I also tried to do more of a staggered intro of them. So the first 30% of the book, it's only rotating between 3 points of view. And then I'll add one more in, and then another, 10% or whatever goes by and I add another. So hopefully you've had time to sort of ground yourself in these initial ones before we then bring in more and more.
That's so clever. I didn't even think of that, but now I see it.
Yeah.
I look at the characters.
Yeah, now you're going to go back and be like, oh yeah, he's Wrath. Yeah. Yeah.
Other questions? I guess
Yes?
we...
Stephanie, you mentioned the 90,000 words.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like all the books I'm reading now are about 400 pages. Is there a rule that it must be that long?
No, there's not. I think that's just the average. Most fall between 90,000 and 100,000. Depending on your genre, if you write fantasy, you could get closer to 140,000. And if it's more literary, it might be more of a novella, so it could be 60 or 70,000. But generally, when most writers start out, I mean, it's not like I'm shooting for 90, but it's that tends to be your average 350-page book. Yeah.
Isn't part of that also expectations of publishing, like
Yeah.
print runs? And
Yeah, I mean, the longer,
number.
this sounds silly, but the longer the book is, the more expensive it is to print. So they don't want it to be 600 pages if it doesn't need to be. So yeah, when you see those long books, you know that it's either they were really on board with the story or the author really fought to have it that long. And it's not super common in thrillers to have them that long, you know.
It's hard to sustain that
Yeah.
amount of suspense over the pages.
Yeah, because I think readers probably get impatient, and it's like, okay, you can only slow burn for so long before you're like, I want some answers. So
Or a body.
yeah, that too.
Any other questions?
He travels a lot too. He's actually in London right now for work. Well, for work we travel separately, but for fun we travel together. So we lived in London for 6 years, and we got to see most of Europe during that time. So yeah, it was a passion that brought us together from the beginning. So we're very much on the same page there.
Looks like we're all out. Patrick, any virtual questions? We'll wait while he scans the site.
As a matter of fact, there are.
Oh, great.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about, do you have any advice for aspiring writers who are trying to get in, and, you know, how to go about it, how to break through their own kind of self-censoring and get words on the page?
Okay, so people who are kind of
Self-editing, maybe?
struggling to write.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I think I don't really believe in writer's block. I think that's just perfectionism, which I'm definitely guilty of. But when I'm really struggling to get going, I find this sounds really silly and simple, but switching from the computer to writing by hand in a journal, there's something about it that just feels very like unofficial and not intimidating, and like I can always just cross it out or throw it away, and this doesn't matter, and it doesn't feel like homework, let's say. Also, like switching the venue of where you are. Sometimes, you know, if I can't get my act together at home, which is where I do 99% of my writing, I'll go to the library or you know, somewhere. If I've commuted somewhere, I'm not going to sit on social media for hours. You know, I'm going to get the writing done. In terms of just coming up with ideas, I think it's just kind of being curious about the world. Everybody's got their like strange interests. Like, why am I so interested in hermits? I don't know, but I am. Like, and so everybody's got their little things. And then I think just kind of following those mini obsessions until it leads you somewhere, you know? Yeah.
How about, you know, it's a cliche to say the path to publication, but can you talk a little bit about how you got your first book published and
Yeah.
the process of getting an agent and all that good stuff?
Sure. So like I said, I wrote Darling Rose Gold as my thesis. And then my thesis chair and reader, they are both published authors themselves. And they were like, I think you could maybe get an agent with this. You should send it out. And so I did, and had a really good response. And then kind of interviewed a few of the agents who offered representation, and then chose one of them. And we did probably 2 or 3 weeks of edits. And then she chose the timing. She tried to pair it with the London Book Fair, which is in March. So we went out very end of February, and she went out in the UK and US at the same time. I think to get into really specifics, like John said, on my website, I have like exactly what I did to get the query done. I don't even know if it's still, if Janet Reed, who is a literary agent, is still running it, but there's a site called Query Shark, which just posts people's queries and comments on, this is why I would ask for more information. This is why I would pass on this one. I studied that religiously. I mean, I must have worked on my query for 6 months alongside finishing the novel and finishing grad school. It's definitely not, the query is not something to just be dashed off like the night before you start sending to agents. Similarly, though, I think a lot of people put the cart before the horse, and they worry so much about the query and so much about agents that we've kind of forgotten, like, you need to have a really good manuscript first. You can't, you know, they're not just going to publish anything no matter how great your pitch is. If your pitch is great, that might get them to open the PDF and read the sample, but they're not going to request the full manuscript unless there's something there. So it's a tricky balance. And like you were saying, there's a big difference between the writing side and the publishing business side. And not everybody, you know, is great at both, but there are services out there that can help you get better at whichever one is the struggle.
You actually published first in shorter format. Is that correct?
Yeah, I published a short story. Yeah.
Would you ever go back to that? Is there a
No,
difference?
I was terrible at writing short stories. So grad MFA programs really encourage you to work on short stories, I think, because it's easier to workshop those in class because they're short. You can go through an entire beginning, middle, and end of a story in a class. With a novel, you obviously can't do that. It's hugely long. It would not work to have 14 students kind of workshopping an entire novel. And so because of that, you can't even, in my program, you could not take a novel writing workshop until your second year. So I wrote a lot of short stories, which I had never done before. I wrote them terribly. I think I sent 7 or 8 out and accrued 220 rejections. And I'm not just saying a funny number. I actually counted them, and there were a lot. So I did get that one story published, which ironically was my least favorite and the one that I was the least jazzed about. But yeah, that was, at the time, it was super exciting because, whatever, it was like a $50 check or something. But I was like, someone paid me for creative writing. But it was a good early lesson in how much rejection comes in this career, which I was a little used to, having come from advertising. My creative director, when he didn't like TV scripts, would just draw a big X across them and throw them on the floor. So you have to have a thick skin in this business. And I think the experiences of advertising, of the grad program, of putting your work out there, no matter what, you don't have to submit short stories, is a good thing, because you have to get used to it and realize it's not personal. It's just, art is subjective, and it's not going to be for everyone. I think every writer wants to write a book that every reader will love, and it's impossible. Yeah. But we still want to, because, you just want to be liked and read.
There's a lot of emphasis put on the community of writers. Do you have a circle that you turn to?
Yes. So I moved to New York a couple years ago, and I said, I am going to say yes to every single invitation that I receive. Every coffee, every book launch event, and at every single one that I went to for the first 6 months, I just tried to meet at least 1 or 2 new people. And the community grew and grew from there. I really wasn't sure what to expect moving to New York because, you hear that New Yorkers are a little cold or, hard to get to know. But the writing community there is so welcoming. And I feel like in the last 2 years, my community has just exploded, which is great because I have a ton of loved ones that are very supportive, but nobody understands exactly what it feels like to be a published author except for other writers. So it's great to have people to kind of commiserate with, to share insider kind of tips and whatever with, to talk about craft, all of that stuff. So yeah, it's been wonderful to have that.
You've scared a lot of readers with your books, intentionally.
Yes.
Is there one particular book that scared you as a reader?
That I didn't write? Like someone else's book? Recently that I can think of, what's it called? Security by Gina Woolsdorf. I think that veers into horror. It's not super well known, and it should be because it does a brilliant point of view thing that I won't give away. It's pretty hard to scare me in books. I'm not really someone but this book, I had to stop reading it at night because I was having nightmares. So I read it in the morning with all the lights on. It does get a little gory, but yeah, I recommend that one if you like a scare.
Patrick, any others? We do have a question.
I was going to ask, how much of your time do you say you spend focusing on developing the plot of your books versus good literature? I guess I don't know, writing just good prose literature versus the actual plot. How much time do you spend?
So I spend a lot of time thinking about how I wish that my prose was different than it is. I read other writers and I'm like, they're so good. But I think part of writing is accepting that your voice is your voice. I think writers beginning writers kind of get caught up in this idea of I've got to find my voice. But your voice is just how you speak, And so I think we're always kind of fantasizing about well, if only I could sound like this person, then I would. So I do spend a lot of time, once the plot is there, sort of cleaning up the sentences and making them as crisp as I can. I think the advertising background helps with that. When you have a billboard and you can only have 5 words on it, you have to learn how to be concise. But yeah, there's definitely, I don't really worry as much about the prose until kind of the plot and characters are there, because I end up throwing so much stuff away that I'm like, if I obsess over this one sentence, it'll probably get cut. So it's a lot of, I think actually what I probably spend the most time on is character development. I think that's the hardest part, is just creating people from scratch. Plots to me are kind of like, you can, there's only, I guess, so many different ways you can go with a plot. So yeah, did that answer your question? Okay.
Do you do character profiles before you write them?
I used to, and I like with Rose Gold, I was like, I got to fill out the biography. Like, what's Patty's favorite soft drink? And then as I get more comfortable with this, I'm like, how is this helping me? I mean, certain things, I suppose, but you find these things online that are like these character questionnaires, like, what's their favorite color? Where do they like to vacation? And I think the further you get in, you're just like, I think that stuff is just, it's something to get you started. So to the question about like, I'm really struggling, I just like don't even know where to go. Like, it's really good to feel like you're at least working towards something, even if you're not writing the actual draft. But now, I don't know. Why did I decide the 7 deadly sins for these characters? I don't know. I just started there and then kind of like worked my way through them. And again, truly, it feels, anytime it's like, well, how did you do this? I'm like, I don't know. At least once in every book that I've written, I have Googled how to write a novel, and I am not joking. It's like you forget, and you're like, how did I do this all the other times? That's weird.
Muscle memory, I guess.
I mean, I think you do go into, when it's going well, you go into a flow state, and it kind of feels like completely vacating your body. I've said before, like if my husband comes in the room when I'm in the middle of one of these and then like asks me a question, it feels like it being woken up from a really deep nap. So a lot of crankiness is involved after that. So I think maybe that's why it's hard to remember exactly what order things happen. Also, you're making 100 decisions every day that you're sitting down, like the amount of decisions that you have to make when you're creating an entire world. It's just hard to remember like the order, and like, I think that maybe people think there's a lot more strategy involved than there is. Like, sometimes you just kind of sit down and you're like, seems good, let's try that. And then if it's not, we'll start over again. So
Yeah, I think Nora Roberts was the one that said you can fix a bad page, but you can't fix a blank page.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think the blank page is the most daunting. And once you have something down, you're like, okay, well, I can at least try to make this better. Yeah.
Last chance for any questions? We do?
Yes.
Can I ask about Rose Gold?
Of course.
Where on earth did you come up with that idea?
The question is, where on earth did I come up with the idea for Rose Gold?
Mother-daughter.
Oh, nice. Thank you for attending. So it's based on, for those who don't know, Munchausen by proxy, which is a disorder where caregivers induce or fake illness in the person they're caring for. It's usually mothers and their children. So yeah, I found out about this crazy behavioral disorder, and I was like, what kind of mother would do this? And I wanted to try to get inside of her head. So even though Rose Gold is the titular character, it was really Patty that drew me in. And I don't know what this says about me, but Patty's voice was just like there from day one. Rose Gold needed a lot of development and reworking, but like Patty was just there. So yeah, I wanted to answer the question, do these people know that what they're doing is wrong, or do they honestly believe the lies that they're telling doctors, teachers, neighbors, because they are very good liars and they're very manipulative, which is how they're able to pull this off for so long. But yeah, I basically just took some real life cases and kind of observed what are the commonalities of the perpetrators, what are the commonalities of the victims or survivors, and then said, okay, these characters need to, at the very least, have these 3 traits, and then from there, how do I flush them out and make them my own? Yeah. Yeah.
Any last questions? I'd like to thank Stephanie Wrobel for being here with us tonight, for writing such wonderful books.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
And thank you all for coming out. I really appreciate
Yes,
it.
thank you, and thank you, virtual audience. You should have signing tickets in your book if you purchased one. Stephanie will be happy to sign up here if you line up by number.
Yes.
Do you need pens?